You get me, got you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, got you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, got you.
We had a pretty good intro a few weeks ago when you came on the show. So, like I said, I was sharing with Carl what my thinking was for this episode. Since we're so close to the to election day, what I'm going to do today is go to some specific states for the presidential race. Then if we have time, look at a couple of the Senate races, maybe even look at the House. But the way I want to do it today is to look at some polls, and just for ease of use, I'll be using the 538 interface. Um, and I'd love to share my thoughts on how I'm looking at those polls, some of my quick takeaways. Like I said, more like I'm a student in one of your classes. And then if you're, if Carl seems to be up for the challenge, he'll Carl will give me some feedback on how I'm thinking about these polls, and then we'll hear some of Carl's own analysis and what he's seeing. So you're still game, right?
I'm in. Let's do it.
All right, cool. I am going to see if this works. I'm going to share my screen so that
All
we're
right.
both looking at the same thing. All right, cool. You can see that, right? Uh,
I can now.
all right, awesome. Expand this. All right, now you see all my show notes actually, right? Um,
That's good.
so let's just go directly to, well, starting with Pennsylvania. A lot of folks are saying that's the swingiest of swing states. It's what the race is largely hinging on. You could see this. I opened directly to the 538's main interface. Now,
Yep.
one thing I caught myself already doing is I'm scrolling immediately past the averages, because what I want to do is I want to go down to the specific polls.
Yep.
So here's what I'm seeing. I see I don't know, about a dozen polls here, and I'll tell you a couple of my first quick takeaways. Um, I have looked at this sometime a few days ago, so I had an expectation, but there's some new polls here. So I'll tell you
Yep.
what, one of the first things I see, second from the top, is Trafalgar. I forget how you say it.
Folger, I
I
think.
don't, I have no interest in what Trafalgar says. The data that they're showing, I have zero interest. I don't know if that's just my own biases or prejudices, but it's basically like the sense I get from the little I do know about Trafalgar is that number one, he doesn't share his work, so that makes me immediately suspicious.
Should be.
But two is I always know that it's going to be a very Trump friendly poll. So it just makes me immediately suspicious. If I were to take a look at it and forget that it says Trafalgar, I'll tell you a couple of other things that jump out at me. One is I like that, and I didn't necessarily get this from you, but tell me if you disagree. But likely voters, and over 1,000 likely voters sampled,
Yep.
surveyed. So that's a positive. I do That's a pretty healthy sample size, and I prefer likely voters to registered voters. So those are a couple.
Pros and cons. Pros and cons. We can talk about that in a minute.
Okay, all right. But then the other thing I see is that 43 and 46, Trump being, quote unquote, you hate this, up by three, as they put it here. I don't care
Sure.
what that is. The thing that I see immediately there, 43 and 40, am I reading that right? I don't have my glasses on. 43 and
46.
46. So that
Yep.
means there is 3 plus 7. So there's 4 plus 7. So there's about 10 points of wiggle room right there.
Yep.
So my
And
question is,
again, here's oh sorry, go ahead. What's your question?
no, my question there is, I wish there was more information. What's happening in those the 10, between 90 and 100%? What makes that up? Is it
Yep.
registered voters? Or excuse me, is it undecided voters? Is it folks who are voting third party? I'd love to know more about what makes up that 10%. That's more so than Trump being, 46 and Harris being 43, as many analysts, as you point out, incorrectly say that's a 3 point spread.
Well, sure,
Um,
yeah.
the biggest thing that jumps out at me is what makes up the 10 points that we don't know about there. So,
Perfect.
okay, so
So I
give me
can
some
tell you're
feed.
a good I can tell you're a good student
Yeah.
because you resisted the urge to say Trump plus three.
Hmm.
And that is the number one thing is that little line there on the right. And then if you go back to the top, how they summarize the presidential race and the Senate race,
Yeah.
um, plus this much is a terrible, terrible metric. I just wrote an article on my Substack recently called "The End of the Spread Method."
Right.
We are actually living through history right now, and you're part of it with me. I relate the spread method to the geocentric model of the Earth, which is the Earth is not the center of the universe, but for 1,000 years, brilliant for 1,000 years, some brilliant scientists came up with math to justify, to make sense of the Earth is stationary and the center of the universe. And the spread method kind of has followed the same pattern of, well, it was wrong about this, but if we look at the numbers this way. So the spread method, if you want to learn more about why that's a terrible way to look at polls, you can read that on my Substack. You can read that in my book. The numbers in that poll, Trump 46, Harris 43, and ignoring for a minute that it's Trafalgar, and they are very, very partisan and not a transparent pollster. That remaining 11% is either third party or undecided. Either third party or undecided. We don't know from this data. One major problem, and I talk about in my book, it's very important. A person who says they are going to vote third party and a person who says they don't know who they are going to vote for are very, very different people. Very, very different people. Just to give you for example of why that's the case. If someone declares in a poll that they plan to vote for Jill Stein, who is the Green Party candidate who tends to be strongly favored on the left and not the right, if someone says, I plan to vote for Jill Stein, it is more likely, if they change their mind, that they would lean more towards Harris than towards Trump.
Okay.
And then if we rewind to 2016, Gary Johnson, the libertarian candidate, well, he's a former Republican. If someone declares in a poll they plan to vote for Gary Johnson, if they change their mind, it's more likely that they will vote for Trump than for, in 2016, Hillary Clinton. So third party and undecided are very different calculations. We don't know how many people said third party, how many people said undecided. But what we do know, this year, unlike 2016, there are very, very, very few people who will vote third party.
Oh.
That number, depending on the state, will probably be anywhere from a few tenths of a percent, maybe up to 2% in a couple states, Michigan, Alaska, but we can get into that in a little bit. One very important calculation that I make, that anyone needs to make when they're analyzing poll data, is how many votes does this candidate need to win? What percentage of the vote does this candidate need to win? I define that as the finish line.
The finish line, right.
Finish line, yes. In every race, because the most votes wins, 50% is the finish line. If a candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, or 50% or more of the vote, they win. In most states, that finish line will be around 49.5%.
Okay.
So I consider a poll that shows a candidate at 49% or above to be relatively strong for that candidate.
Yeah.
Polls like this, 46, 43, just because Trump is ahead, that doesn't tell us a whole lot. That doesn't tell us a whole lot. And on the note, and while we're digging into the meaning of these polls, different pollsters ask questions different ways.
Right.
Which means if a pollster asks, if the election were today, would you vote for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? Some pollsters, if you say, I'm not sure yet, they go, oh, okay, not sure yet, undecided, got it. But some pollsters say, okay, I understand that you're undecided, but if you had to choose, who would you choose? Some pollsters ask that follow-up question and some pollsters don't. So you might notice, and I can't see it on my screen because it's a little small, but I would wager that somewhere on this screen, there are polls with, say, 2 to 3% undecided. And then there are others with, look, it broke out the third party.
Yeah. There are a couple here. So Redfield and Wilton Strategies, The Telegraph, and Atlas Intel have a couple of drop downs. And just for listeners that aren't on YouTube, so the Redfield one has 48 Harris, 48 Trump, 1% Oliver, 0% Stein. That still leaves us with three. And again, forgive me if I'm using the wrong term, but 3 points of wiggle room. We don't know what the rest of the three.
Undecided.
Yeah, three. So is it, but, oh, right. So we can better determine that those are three undecided because this poll asked about third party candidates. We see 1%, 1 point for Oliver, 0% for Stein. So we can better, but that 3 points makes a huge difference. The 3% of undecideds that we can better, it's at least closer to knowing that it's undecideds because they asked about the third party.
Exactly. They asked about the third party. And in that case, with 48-48, they also probably asked if you had to choose which candidate would you lean towards.
Right.
And when we talk about asking or how to best ask poll questions, there's not really like a formula for it. It's really a preference of the pollster. If you give the option to someone on the phone or in a survey, they're clicking a button, if you give them the option to be undecided, they're more likely to state that they're undecided. But if you ask them a follow-up question, there are pros and cons to that methodology. So when we look at some polls that have 10% undecided and other polls with maybe 2% undecided, those aren't irreconcilable.
Okay.
Those can both exist. Both of those pollsters can be good pollsters. Then it gets into how they ask the question. How
Right.
they ask the question gets into why there could be such a discrepancy there. So Trafalgar, again, not a great, not a good pollster. They're not good. Not just because they're partisan,
Yeah.
because weirdly enough, some partisan pollsters still do decent work. But Trafalgar is one where they're not transparent with their data, so I prefer not to use them. I look at what they're doing to
Hmm.
see if they're fixing their methodology issues, but that's one where I don't even consider them. Qantas there at the top, they're slightly better, but they're very new and they lean very partisan as well. Atlas Intel, it's hard to get a read on. I do include Atlas Intel in my poll averages
Okay.
because they are more transparent, but they're not listed as partisan here, but they do seem to be rather partisan with their numbers. So it's hard to quantify how partisan or how biased a pollster may be. But when we're just looking at the numbers, when we're just looking at the candidates' numbers, in an election like this with very, very, very few third party candidates,
Yeah.
the main thing that we're looking for is how close the candidates are to 50. Not in one poll, but consistently. Are they
Consistently.
consistently in that range?
Right, right. So as I look at a few others, Morning Consult has a pretty good reputation. The Washington Post, George Mason, again,
Yep.
of the two that they're offering, I look at the likely voters, good sample sizes, over 700 with the George Mason one,
Yep.
almost 1,400 with Morning Consult. These are from about a week or so ago. Um, and Morning Consult has Harris at 49, Trump at 48.
Yep.
George Mason has Harris at 49, Trump at 47.
Yep.
The other one, Atlas Intel, you mentioned. So that's another one that has a drop down. Harris, but again, you said that they seem to be partisan. But I'll share anyway. Harris 47, Trump 50, Stein 2, Oliver 1. Now, to me, that looks a little fishy because they got to 100%, which based
Yep.
on what you just said, if I had to make a guess now, I would guess that they asked the question so that instead of allowing for any undecideds in this poll, they got to 100% decideds in that
Yep.
poll.
Yep.
So that there it raised it, maybe not fishy, but it raises a question in my mind about those.
Yeah, in an election like this with fewer undecideds, especially now that we're very close to the election, that isn't a red flag for their methodology.
Okay.
But it does. You should maybe not consider the weight of those numbers so heavily. For example, just to give you a for example, if a candidate is polling at 50%, their competitor is polling at say 46%, and then the rest are undecided. That 50 with 4% undecided carries more weight than a 50% with zero undecided, if
Okay.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because again, that 50% with no undecided leaves the wiggle room thing that you said.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
if that 50% is an overstatement, well, there's no way for them to make that up now,
Right.
to make up that difference if that 50% is an overstatement. Whereas if there are 6% undecided and the 50 is an overstatement, or sorry, 4% undecided, if the poll is 50-46 with 4% undecided and 50 is an overstatement, well, there's still a good chance that the candidate wins at least 1 or 2% of those undecideds to make up what they were overstated. So that's one thing that I do account for in my forecasts is how much of that undecided was forced and how much of it is genuine.
Yeah.
So some of these polls that you're seeing with 10% undecided, in my forecast, I take it for what it is, or sorry, in my poll averages, sorry. In my poll averages, I take it for what it is, but in my forecast, I'm using data to figure out who these undecideds are, and I figure out what the best probabilities are to allocate.
Okay. Now, before I ask you for your analysis on Pennsylvania, there's one other. I found a really cool analyst. And he specializes in Pennsylvania. I'm
Yeah.
guessing that you're familiar with Joshua Smiley as well, or Smithley. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you know what's funny? Someone tagged me on one of his posts and
Yeah.
said, "Hey, you should follow Real Carl Allen because he does a lot of similar analysis to you." And he said, "I follow him. I read his book. I've already incorporated." Can you believe that?
That's
That
awesome.
that's wild for me. That is absolutely wild for me. Someone that I hadn't like actively talked to, and he really does great work. That work that he's doing right there, the early vote analysis and things like that. I try to do that, and I'm okay at it.
Yeah.
But other people are better at it, and I use their work to inform some of the things that I'm doing on election night instead of trying to reinvent some of the things that they're doing. So he's doing awesome work. He is definitely kind of what I would consider an up and coming. I don't even know how old he is. I don't know if he's in college or if he's
Seems like a
my
young
age.
guy from what I can tell, but
Yeah, I'm not sure, but in terms of like how the quality of his work versus
yeah.
how well known he is, he's definitely like an up and coming analyst.
I'll put a link to his Twitter profile on in the show notes. But for folks who aren't looking at it, it's at Blocked Freak, which is blocked FREQ on Twitter. And just so folks who are listening and not watching know what we're looking at, Joshua puts up empirical information. He gives a little bit of analysis after he puts that up. What he's putting up in this case, it's the last one I saw was Pennsylvania 2024 general election day 12. These are early votes, vote by mail splits. So far there's about 1.1 million votes cast. Now I think what I'm looking at here is blue Dem are registered Democrats who've returned their votes, which I think what he's saying here is 684,724, which makes up about 62.7% of Democrats who asked for vote by mail. And correct me if I'm wrong about what I'm reading here.
Oh, you're right.
Okay, so Republican voters so far have submitted 328,074 votes, which is 56.7% of Republican registered voters who've asked for vote by mail. Independents are 110,711, which is 47.3% returned. Let's see, am I missing something here? Oh, he does give the vote by mail splits and the ballot edge. So far, the ballot edge is 356,650 in favor of Democrats with return edge of zero point 0.6. I guess it's 0.6%. And then he gives some analysis, but what he's providing is empirical, hard data. And then you can derive what you'd like from there. One of the interesting things that he said in past posts, one is that we'll likely see more GOP registered voters voting for Harris then we'll see Democratic registered voters voting for Trump, and independents seem to be breaking for Harris more so than Trump. But that's not empirical. That's from maybe other information that he's gathering and projections he's making. So what do you think about this last post that he made?
Yeah, so vote by mail and early vote data varies by state.
Yeah.
So depending on the state you're looking at, some states provide you a ton of data in terms of registered voters, age, gender, and method of voting. But Pennsylvania is one that provides a good amount of data. So all we know is the party affiliation of these people who have returned their ballots and the method of voting, whether they voted early in person or whether they voted by mail. What we're seeing in Pennsylvania is rather expected
Hmm.
Pennsylvania Democrats are returning ballots much more quickly. They've requested many more ballots than Republican candidates. What's interesting, and we'll talk about this more when we get to other states, is Republicans for the first time in 2024 are actively encouraging their supporters to vote early.
Hmm.
So the term that's been brought up a lot is this cannibalization.
Okay.
Traditionally, traditionally Republicans vote in huge numbers on election day itself, which means the vote by mail and early vote numbers that Democrats have, that gives them a huge edge going into election day. And the hope is for Democrats that that lead is big enough to sustain that pressure, that day of pressure from Republicans who tend to vote in person. But the question is, with Republicans voting earlier more often now and voting by mail more often now, is are they just moving these votes on election day to voting early? That is a very hard analysis because we have no comparisons for it. There's no precedent
Right.
for this election. Just like there was no precedent for 2020 with COVID when record number of people voted by mail, 2024 is another, we have no precedents for this. So this analysis is very important. But whenever I get the question of what does this mean? Is this good or is this bad? I can only give you a feeling. I can't tell you for sure what it means. And in
Okay.
Pennsylvania, these numbers look very promising for Democrats. But all that being said, election day rolls around, Republicans get better than expected election day support, and it could end up being extremely close.
Yeah. Yeah. So going back to this list of polls from what we can see, um, one is I'd love your analysis from what you've seen so far, and maybe if there are other polls that have jumped out at you in addition to the ones that we're seeing in the first dozen or so, or the most recent dozen or so that 538 is showing. Just large takeaways analysis about what you're seeing in Pennsylvania right now.
I have a specific pollster that I want to shout out for doing quality work, but I have to preface it with a kind of a caution.
Okay.
No pollster, no matter how great they are, no matter how quality their work is, can possibly be better than a polling average. That's the unfortunate reality of this field, is that polls by nature are an inexact tool, an imprecise tool. In chapter 4 of my book, this concept of an ideal poll,
Yeah.
even a pollster who conducts everything perfectly by a scientific measure is still subject to fluctuation. So we have to value, unlike 538, who says that the best pollsters are the ones who best predict the election result.
Yeah.
We have to get away from that mindset.
Yeah.
We have to get away from that literary digest. They predicted it, therefore they were good.
Right.
We have to get away from that mindset because the best pollsters often will not be the ones who are closest to the result. We have to value good methodology, which is to say we have to be process oriented more than we are results oriented. So on that note, with that out of the way, I
Yeah.
have to give credit to the Bullfinch Group. They have done something that I have been advocating for since I first started researching this topic. And what they've done is they've taken their poll data and they have transparently laid out the entire process.
Mm.
They did not weight their data. They did not. They reported everything exactly as it was, and they said these are our results. If you want to weight them based on this, you can do it this way. If you want to weight them based on this, you can do it this way. But we are being totally transparent about our data, which is the exact opposite of what some other polling companies do. And they say, here it is. Now, this is not to say whatever their results are. Honestly, I could not tell you if their results are favorable for Harris or Trump. And I think it actually varies by state. But what they are doing in terms of transparency, I think sets a beautiful standard
Mm.
for hopefully how things can improve in this field. Pollsters and polling companies should be competitive. They should compete, but they should compete for who does the best work, not who
Right.
makes the best predictions.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So just so folks know, the Bullfinch is showing recent polls, October 11th through October 17th, 600 sample of likely voters. There were two that came in, same likely voters 600 sample. Harris 49, Trump 48 in one. Harris 49, Trump 49, even in the other. Now, is their questioning such that they're asking folks to make a choice if they had to, as opposed to allowing folks to say, I don't know yet or undecideds?
I think they do ask that follow-up question. If you are undecided and you had to choose, who would you vote for?
Yeah.
Their acronym their acronym is FUCT, fully unweighted, completely transparent. Of it. And they lay out every single question that they asked, the results to the question, what the possible results mean, and they also even go as far as to say other pollsters do it this way, and here's why we don't think that this is, or why we think being transparent is important, because you can very easily see how a otherwise good pollster who wanted a result favorable for a certain candidate could nudge the numbers just 1 or 2 points in their candidate's direction, and it looks entirely legitimate. It is entirely legitimate, but it might not be the best quality of work if we're valuing transparency.
Okay. So yeah, the big question now is what is your forecast telling us about Pennsylvania as we stand right now?
Yep. In my forecast, I have Harris favored in Pennsylvania. She is a 68%, at 68% probability to win Pennsylvania. That is tied with Michigan, to get ahead of ourselves. Pennsylvania and Michigan have different underlying factors. Michigan tends to be a little bit stronger for Democrats, but there are some things working against Democrats there. But in Pennsylvania, everything that I've seen in the polls tends to point towards Harris being a favorite. That being said, that doesn't mean Harris is going to win Pennsylvania by 5 comfortably easy. But I will say in my forecast, it is more likely that Harris wins by 3 and have her getting to 51%, Trump at 48%. It is more likely that she wins by 3 than that she loses by 1.
Why do you
Because
say, wait,
Trump,
why do you say
yeah,
that?
it's highly unlikely that Trump gets above 50 to 50 and a half. In
Okay.
order for him to win by more than 1, he has to get above 50 and a half. It's very hard for him to surpass that ceiling because of some of the demographics that he's losing. He's losing Republicans. He's losing independents. All he's doing is building his base.
Right.
To his credit, he has done a decent job of refilling some of the voters that he's lost. But I don't think there's a good bet that it's going to be enough in those blue wall states. And Pennsylvania is probably Harris's strongest state right now in the blue wall, that is,
Okay.
of the swing states. So it's interesting the way the forecast numbers play out. But again, that being said, Trump has about a 1 in 3 chance of winning Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
68.
that 1 in 3 chance is very close to the likelihood he wins the election because Pennsylvania is that important.
Right.
So just because it's more likely that Harris wins doesn't mean that Trump getting to 50 to 50 and a half and winning by 5/10 or 1 point isn't possible, because it is, unfortunately, for my background and my desired outcome, very possible.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we talked about it last time. If he's got a 32% chance, it's kind of like, in baseball, if you're hitting 320 for your career, you're going to the Hall of Fame. I don't like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
If I don't want him to win. So the next one I had was Michigan. So again, I'm going to jump over the average, the poll average, and I'm going to
Yeah.
go down directly to the list of some polls. Uh,
Right.
Quinnipiac, good reputation. Again, I see immediately that there's over 1,100 likely voters sampled. And
Got it.
then in these two polls conducted between October 17th and 21st, very recent. And I see in one that they have Harris at 50, Trump at 46. That's interesting. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So that'll make sense because I did have a question about a certain portion of the population in Michigan. Their second poll, again, 1,136 likely voters, conducted same time, October 7th through 21st. And they have Harris at 49, Trump at 46. So again, a couple of things that jump out at me. 4 points of wiggle room in one and 5 points of wiggle room in the other. Now let's see. There's a drop down here.
That's going
Okay.
to be your third parties for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Stein at 1, West at 1, Oliver at 0, Terry at 0. So that covers in the second of the Quinnipiac polls, that gets us to 49, 46. That gets us to 97 accounted
Yep.
for. So one of the questions I have about Michigan is in the primaries, I think it was called the undeclared, people who
Yeah.
voted as a protest vote
Yep.
that might have otherwise voted, in this case, for Democrats, and they voted as undeclared.
Yep.
So how significant do you think that portion of the population is, or are there other factors that I'm not even thinking about right now?
Oh, you're right on. In Michigan, there is a large Muslim population who have traditionally been pretty reliable voters for Democrats. But because of the issue in Gaza, because those voters feel that Biden has not done a good enough job in the Middle East and specifically in Gaza, they wanted him to not win the primary, number one. But number two, I don't think most of them will follow through and vote for Kamala Harris. I
Mm,
think those voters will either vote for Jill Stein or they will not vote. I don't think most of them will vote for Trump, but I do think Jill Stein will perform better in Michigan than she does in any other state. Not necessarily because she's a better candidate for that issue, but just because she gives those voters an option. She's spoken to their concerns, and they have refused on a matter of principle to vote for Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or the Democrats. Some of them will follow. Some of them will kind of come home, so to speak, and vote for Kamala Harris. But I would be shocked if Jill Stein doesn't get at least 100,000 votes in Michigan.
okay.
Most of which would have previously been considered reliable or somewhat reliable Democratic voters because of that issue in Gaza. Now, the question then becomes how important is that for the election? Could that 100,000, even 200,000 wouldn't be surprising to me. Could that number of voters be decisive in the election? The probability is greater than zero, right? If we're talking about a scenario where Harris is narrowly ahead in Michigan before accounting for those, then yes. But the best probability, the most likely outcome is that 100,000 is not decisive in the election outcome. My median forecast has Harris winning Michigan by about 2.5. So that has her getting to about 51 again. That's again accounting for Jill Stein taking about 1% of third party vote there. So the possible outcomes, the range of possible outcomes in Michigan, just like Pennsylvania, yes, it is possible that Trump gets to 50 and wins. But the question about Muslim majority voters is a big one. When I forecasted the UK elections back in July, there were a ton of constituencies. Their constituencies are like our districts, where Gaza was a huge issue. A lot of voters in those constituencies traditionally had favored labor, which are pretty close to our Democrats, and they didn't come home. They voted third
Mm.
party. They voted independent. And it was in numbers that were largely unexpected by other forecasters because they assumed that they would come home. The reality is they didn't. And in Michigan, I don't think most of them will.